Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here, and appreciate everyone sitting still for so long. I was kind of at the end myself. My back's kind of giving out, so I needed to stand up anyway. I'm going to give a talk about using administrative data for program evaluation, but I think the way we want to sell this is we're going to try and combine evidence-based policy with big data. Those are two kind of big buzzwords these days, and I think that's more or less what this conference is about, and what the VisitINPS program is about, is trying to combine the opportunities that emerge from the availability of the kind of data that's in the INPS system with the need to provide more scientifically based evidence on what different programs are actually doing to the types of participants and so on. I'm going to start very basically, and I'm not entirely sure, I might be a little too basic here, but what exactly is administrative data? Usually, in most countries, the administrative data system that's being studied is derived from a tax or benefit system. In Italy, the INPS system, my understanding is it's basically constructed to keep track of pension eligibility. In Germany and Austria, as Josef was just saying, the system is based on Social Security earnings records that are submitted by firms as part of the tax system. In the U.S., there's three basic types of administrative data that are used. One is a Social Security system, so that's the system that is keeping track of the public pension records. A second system is the unemployment insurance system, so that's a separate administrative system that keeps track of taxes that are collected and payments that are made when people become unemployed. And then the third system, because it's the U.S., we have to have at least three, is the IRS, which is the income tax system. And all three of those are used in different studies in the U.S. And then finally, there's a lot of other countries that have administrative data that are starting to be used. I've worked on a project in Brazil, the French, Belgian, Netherlands, and of course the Nordic countries are in some sense the leaders in this, with most detailed administrative types of data available. What's available from administrative data in most of the projects today, I think, are basically using is the individual micro records from the system itself. So you're actually using the micro data. Now, that isn't the only use of the administrative data system. And in fact, a very innovative system in the U.S. Constructs every month a large variety of finely grained statistics that describe the labor market. For reasons that are completely obscure to even me, it's called the QCEW program. But what this is it's a set of statistics on how many jobs have been created, how many jobs have been destroyed, the average earnings of the jobs that are created, destroyed, and ongoing in each county or sub-county level. And researchers have been using these data, even though they don't have access to the micro records. They can use these data for lots of purposes to cover almost the same types of questions. And so as you're thinking about uses of administrative data, I think that it's a really innovative idea would be to use an administrative system to throw off regularly publishable data that can be used for policy evaluation very broadly without doing, doing all the work yourself each time. So what's in a typical administrative database? Well, most of the databases have a person-year structure, which is that there's information about a person, and I'm going to use the phrase PID, or person ID. That's the linking variable that identifies a person. In Italy, it would be a person's fiscal code. In the United States, you're not allowed to use that word because that's private. So we always call it a person ID. Of course, it is the same thing, but we are not allowed to say that. We have, in a typical system, you have some measure of the amount paid by an employer to that person in a year. So that's the structure of the database in Germany, in Austria, and in most of these U.S. systems. Some of them have a finer level, maybe a quarterly pay system, the unemployment insurance system. And that essentially is the basic record. Now, in addition, in some systems you have more detail, so you have information on the person, age and gender. Surprisingly enough, even gender isn't available in some of the US systems. So you'll see studies using administrative data which don't even mention gender because they don't know that. In the Germanic countries, you normally have, and it's because of the nature of the tax law and how different jobs are taxed, you would have something like a full-time and a part-time and maybe a managerial, and that would be the way Inps works as well, indicator, and that is really coming about for historical reasons because of the different types of pensions that are available. And then on the firm side, or the employer side, you have typically a piece of information that tells you the location of the firm. And that's extremely useful because that allows you then to know that this person was working in this location in that year. And that is the basis of a lot of different studies. It's a very simple idea, but it actually gives you very fine-grained geographic information, which is actually not possible to obtain from other data sources and reliably. Sometimes there's an industrial sector indicator that's also quite helpful for a variety of reasons. One is that in a lot of other databases, you have to ask a person what kind of job they work for, and there's a lot of misclassification error. If I ask you the type of employer you have, it's quite a bit of slippage, and whereas this is actually a formal register that the employer, him or herself, is providing. And then finally, there's in most of these systems, there's some kind of employer ID. Most often it's an EIN, an employer tax ID, or some scrambled version of that, and that's going to also be extremely useful. One very, very important aspect of that, again, an almost trivial but extremely important aspect, and we saw this used in some of the papers this morning, is that since I know the EIN for each person each year, I know who's a coworker. And that actually has been a major opening up of research in labor economics. We didn't, until these data were available, know who worked with who. And you might think, well, how can that possibly be useful? But it's amazingly important. And a lot of insights are being derived from this idea that you can just say, this group of people all work for the same employer. Then some of those people will go on and work for other employers in the future, but you will be able to retain that information and say, this person was at some point connected to that person. And so it's opening up a possibility of what's called in computer science a kind of a network analysis. Okay, in the best administrative databases, there's a lot more information available. One piece of information that, for instance, is available in Inps, not available in the US databases, is a day's work, because you have an actual start and end date for any job spell. So in the US, strangely enough, the record says, I paid this person $10,000 last year, but it doesn't say when the start and end of the job was, because there's no reason to keep track of that information in the US. A lot of European systems have this variable, and that's important. Some of the data systems have information on education and occupation, and this is extremely useful because of interest in classifying the types of jobs and opportunities, dealing with things like technology change and trade and so on. It's very important to know what kind of education and occupation characteristics workers have. Some of the countries have information on immigrant status, so the German system has that. Some countries have it but don't make it available to researchers. A few databases have information on the worker's home address, and that's pretty innovative, and it allows you to study things like commuting times and commuting distances and so on. And then finally, a lot of administrative systems, but not all, are, because of the nature of the system, are directly attached to some form of benefit receipt. So for instance, in the US system and also in Germany and Austria, the record system has direct information on any spell of unemployment, regular paid unemployment. So that means that you can use that administrative database to study transitions between employment and unemployment, insured unemployment, a period of spell paid for unemployment. In the US system, Social Security system, there's information on when you start to receive the public pension, which is called Social Security in US, as well as disability insurance. And this, of course, is a major issue in many countries, is a high rate of disability. there's a very unusual database collected in Portugal, which actually has a lot more information, including the firm's sales and the hours of work of each individual. And depending on the particular country, that may or may not be a big issue. Hours of work is a very important element of something like the gender gap. And so in the absence of direct information on how much people are working, it can be convoluted with an issue of gender, for example. Okay, so what are the strengths of administrative data? I've mentioned some of these sort of indirectly, but I would say that the number one strength that comes along is this idea that you have full coverage of the formal sector. So you actually have the ability to study uncommon events. And many, many important events are nevertheless fairly uncommon. So for instance, moving to a spell of unemployment is only going to happen, 5-10% probability each year. And you need to have a fairly dense sample to actually get reasonable numbers of people who are unemployed. In fact, that's been a problem in estimating unemployment since they started doing it in the 1940s. By having full coverage, you eliminate all the sampling error. So you eliminate the fact that if you just had 10% or 5% or typically less than 1% of a sample, you're actually getting variability in what you can measure that's purely arising from the fact that you've got a sample. So that's completely eliminated. And then because of this granularity, and we've seen this today in a couple of the studies already, we'll see it this afternoon as well, you're going to be able to find someone who looks like someone else. And that's going to be the basis of a lot of the research designs that are trying to evaluate specific policies. You're actually going to find someone who participated in a program or was affected by a program, and you're going to find someone else who looks a lot like that person in terms of past history, for example, but was not in the program. And that's going to be the basis of the scientific evaluation. So the second thing, and it's related to this, is you have this complete longitudinal history for both the person and the employer. And that's extremely important because it's going to enable pre- and post comparisons. And most of the research designs that we saw this morning effectively amount to looking at someone before and after something happened to them, some kind of program. For example, did they go on maternity leave? Or did they have a baby? Did they go to school? And so on. That's going to facilitate pre-post comparisons. It also means, because you've got this complete longitudinal history, and I'll talk about this later on a bit, you can do a complete long-term follow-up. And if a program was run, for example, the program we saw this morning, the paper we saw this morning on the education system in the 1960s, that was a long time ago. There's no longer a lot of information available, but we can still go back into the admin system and find out what happened to those people as they get to retirement. And I'm involved in a project in the US now where we're taking all the children who were interviewed in the 1940 census, and we can follow them for basically their entire life by matching them to the administrative system. Almost, most of those people are now, unfortunately, passed away. A couple of more strengths. We have, in a lot of systems, we have access to the exact variables that determine program eligibility. Now that seems again like a trivial point, but in usual types of data sets that labor economists like me had used prior to the availability of these kind of data, we would not precisely know whether someone was eligible for a program or not. Often program eligibility depends on very specific features of a job history which are poorly recorded or aren't available in an ordinary data set. So the whole idea of, say, the Inps system is to keep track of your pension eligibility. So for sure I know if you're eligible for a pension or not, and which kind of pension. And that is extremely important and useful, especially for a scientific evaluation, where oftentimes the basic idea of the evaluation is to make extremely narrow comparisons. There's reduced measurement error, so there's less slippage in determining eligibility. Now, I've used a lot of administrative data systems in my life, and unfortunately, there is never a data system that doesn't have a lot of measurement error. So even the best pension record system has surprisingly difficult types of errors that you can't really figure out why they're there. So you don't get rid of it, but you get rid of some of it. And then finally, and this is, we've seen some of this today, and we'll see it later this afternoon as well, the person ID and the firm ID allow you to link the database to other sources of information. So for example, the studies that we saw today that were linking in balance sheet information or income statement information are taking the employer tax ID and going to another database which has been collecting information on, say, sales and so on, and making a link. In the Nordic countries, because they maintain this sort of unified population register, you can actually link a person back to the population register, which then has complete information on who their parents were and where they've lived all their lives. Actually, such a register-like thing exists in the US, but it's not usually available to researchers. It will become available, I think, in the next few decades, depending on what Mr. Trump's able to do. Okay, limitations. So although there's a lot of strengths of administrative data, there's also quite a few limitations. One is that there's no data on the untaxed sector. And in a country like Italy, but even in the United States, that's a big deal. You can see people disappear. You're not entirely sure where they are. One possibility is they're working in the informal sector. There's no direct information on how time spent out of work is being allocated, so we don't know whether someone's really unemployed or sitting at home playing video games. Okay, so we don't know if they're searching for work or not. A lot of databases have no direct family linkages. Now, we saw some workarounds. Typically, the way that you can link people would be the birth of a child. So when a child is born in a lot of administrative systems, a record is created for that child which says this is the mother and this is the father because they're eligible for some benefits. And that then creates an intergenerational link, which I predict going forward is going to be extremely useful. Because if we know who your parents are, we can start to use these databases to study intergenerational links. We can start to evaluate programs that may or may not be designed to improve or try to improve the intergenerational mobility, for example. There's no information on non-labor income or transfers, at least in most systems, unless you can directly link in those other systems. So you often have no information on consumption and other welfare-relevant things. Okay. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit, but one of the big issues facing someone who uses these data is you can't directly use, almost very rarely can you directly use just the system itself. You have to build a database that includes the administrative system and something else. So in a few cases, the administrative database itself, in a few cases, the database itself has direct information on program participation. So, for instance, in Germany, the system actually has direct records on when someone enters unemployment. And that means that you can directly take the database and start studying unemployment with no further work. So you don't have to do an elaborate build to do that. In some cases, the program is universal. So, for example, labor market reforms, like we saw the first talk this morning, those basically apply to all firms. And so those kind of programs, minimum wages and some kinds of labor market reforms, you basically know who's eligible. You don't have to go to another database. A third way is to bring in a list of participants. And this is what's been done in a lot of programs to evaluate training programs and active labor market policies. So the ALMP is being operated in some way, and that you've got information on who participated in that program. You bring in the IDs for that. In some databases, for example, in the Nordic countries, the ALMPs are offered through the unemployment insurance system, so you get that for free. And of course, there's a lot of links to other databases. I'll mention some of these in my examples. I just want to mention a couple of more innovative uses of the administrative data that you're going to see coming in the future. Alan Kruger, who's going to be talking later this afternoon, has a really interesting project where they took the administrative database of unemployment insurance records, they drew people who were collecting benefits, and then they went and surveyed them. So they used the administrative database as a survey pool to find people who are in a category, and then they can link the two databases together and add the power of the administrative data, so all this background history of the people, with what you can add to that from the survey. And we're going to see, you see this in some of the Nordic countries already, people conducting experiments based in the database. So they would be doing, for example, an evaluation of a particular kind of training program, and they would actually run an experiment in which somebody who was in the program was collecting unemployment benefits. Some sample of those people would be assigned to treatment or control in a classic design. And this is a pretty important point. Many builds require interagency cooperation. And that's the death of many, many great projects, because there's a lot of hurdles to linking data between databases. For example, this may seem strange, but the database in Germany, which is designed to collect information on pension eligibility, is not directly linked to the pension system. So you can't tell when someone disappears from the database whether they're actually collecting pensions. And there's a law in Germany, because of a long history of after the war, that does not allow the pension agency and the labor agency to put their data together without a lot of work and a lot of lawyers. A lot of German lawyers takes a lot of time. And in the US, there often are, I've called it bureaucratic silos, but that's kind of a nice phrase for what it really is, which is two bureaucrats just refuse to cooperate with each other. And so that's really been, those two sources, either legal or bureaucratic impediment, have really slowed down certain kinds of work. Okay, so how do people evaluate programs, active labor market programs or other kinds of programs? How do they evaluate it? Well, there's basically 4 kinds of research designs. The one that we've seen today, I think in all the talks, is this so-called difference of differences design, which was, I believe, first used by economists in the 1970s by Orley Eschenfelter, my thesis advisor. And this idea is to build a comparison group that's like the treatment group, and that you can follow before and after. So the reason why it's called difference of differences is because you take the difference between the two groups before the program, and then you look at the difference after, and you say, well, that must be attributable to the program, or hopefully will be attributable to the program. Many recent studies are using very sophisticated versions of a difference of differences, where the control group is very carefully selected to mimic a lot of characteristics of the program group. And you can do that with administrative data because you've got the depth, you've got the granularity to find people, and you've got the information. So I can exactly match one person and another person in terms of their 5 years of previous employment history. I could get it down to like their monthly earnings were exactly the same in every of the previous 60 months. And there's a lot of projects that are doing that kind of work. There's 3 other designs that are being used. One of them is the regression discontinuity design, which is useful for programs that have a sharp eligibility threshold. We saw sort of a version of this morning with the threshold at 15 employees, but because of the difficulty of defining 15 employees in the system, it's a little bit fuzzy. It isn't quite as sharp. But for instance, in Germany, unemployment benefits extend for a longer period of time once you get to age 40. And so that creates a really interesting opportunity where you can compare someone who loses a job at age 39.99 and someone else who loses a job at age 40.01, and you can compare those two people, and one of them is eligible for 10 or 15 more weeks of benefits than the other. So that design is being used. There's a related design where there's a kink in the policy rule, and the most common kind of kink in a policy rule is a maximum benefit. So, for example, if you're unemployed, you'll get a benefit, but the amount that you get is topped out, and that creates a potential design as well. And then, of course, there's randomized controlled trials, which is sort of the gold standard, but often a little bit hard to convince people to do. Okay, so let me quickly then talk through a few examples of how this has been working. And I have to apologize. Given the general audience, I decided not to put pages and pages of references. So there's thousands of people who've written papers, and they're kind of in these categories here, and I'm going to not tell you who they are, but I'd be available to discuss that. So one area where there's a lot of research is in active labor market programs, where people have used them in data. And so the state of the art in this area now, say exemplified by the studies that have been done of the Hartz reforms in Germany, would be to use administrative data plus bring in some information from the system on who was in a program and who wasn't, and use a pre and post design with many years before and several years after to evaluate the program. And that data solves a lot of problems that were identified in the 1980s and 70s in terms of program. And as I mentioned before, and have emphasized, this allows you to have these very detailed comparison groups that make the scientific comparison, I think, more credible. You've also got the possibility for long-term follow-up so that you can say, this person was in a training program 5 years ago. Is it paying off better now, or have the benefits dissipated? A second area is in welfare reforms. This is a very important area of research in the Anglo countries. So in the 1990s, the U.S. adopted a whole series of reforms, and a lot of those are evaluated, have been evaluated, using administrative data tossed out by the unemployment insurance system, sometimes with a randomized control group. I was involved in a program, an experimental program in Canada that looked at an incentive program to get people who were collecting welfare benefits into work. And the original design of that program was to use administrative records. Now, we never actually got access to the administrative records. So we wrote many studies using survey data. However, we've recently obtained, 15 years later, we've recently obtained data, permission to go back into the administrative system. And now we're going to follow the long-term effects of having been in this program on the children. And that's the kind of thing you can do with administrative data because the data is never lost. The collected information in 1990s on who was in this program and basically the Social Security numbers of the children. And now we can go and see, okay, so what happened? Was the fact that your mother was receiving this kind of program versus that kind of program, did that affect anything? And there's some program evaluations like that taking place in the U.S. as well. Third example is unemployment insurance system. There's a couple people in this room who've done a lot of studies in this area. So there's been studies of the effect of the duration of benefits using this sharp design that some people are eligible for longer benefits just because they've been a little bit older. There's some variation, some studies of the effect of the replacement rate, the amount you get, that typically use this kink design arising around the max benefit. Some of the most innovative work is looking at the effect of unemployment benefits, not on the beneficiaries themselves, but on other people in the same labor market, the so-called spillover effects. And again, this is the kind of thing you can do with admin data because you've got the granularity and the possibility of saying these people are in exactly the same labor market. This one was getting unemployment benefits. How is that affecting the job opportunities of this other one? There's a nice study of a system that Joseph and colleagues have done. There's an interesting study in the French system that looks at that. A fourth example, minimum wages. This is, of course, very topical in Germany right now, and there's some new work trying to use the administrative data to look at what happened with this big new high minimum wage in Germany. Labor market reforms, we've seen some discussion of that. There's a lot of interesting work, especially in Italy. There is going to be some research like this in other countries, Portugal and possibly Spain. But I think right now Italy's ahead on the labor market reform area. Pension reforms. There's been some studies in the U.S. A really interesting study follows up actually on a project that Alan Kruger did years ago using non-administrative data and shows that using the administrative system, they could study very precisely a reform which was introduced affecting people born in 1917 relative to people born before that date. And there was essentially an error in the Social Security system which gave very generous benefits to people born before 1917. And afterwards, these guys kind of got much lower benefits. And with the detailed information you have in the administrative system, you can compare people who were born literally December 30th, 1916 versus January 2nd, 1917. And that's the design that used in this project. And we've seen similar kinds of projects like this analyzed elsewhere. Immigration reforms, we saw a little bit of discussion about this morning. Christian Dussman has a couple of interesting studies of that using administrative data. Again, because immigrants are relatively rare, you need something like an administrative database to find them and to find out where they're working and who they're working with. We saw today this idea of using the coworkers where they were able to say these guys became regularized. How did that affect the coworkers who were in the same firm, which you could only do with this administrative type system? Criminal justice reform. So this is a really a big area right now in the U.S. because we have a lot of crime, and we spend a lot of money. So there's a couple of recent projects which are linking the criminal justice system, people getting out of prison, to earnings afterwards and earnings before. And of course, in the criminal justice system, they're experimenting all the time, inadvertently and advertently sometimes, with differences in how much people are sentenced and so on. So they're using able to do lots of research designs. And there's a similar study looking at foster care, which is the care system for people, children whose parents are no longer able to take care of them. And there's a lot of interesting possibilities in this area, and some have been done in the Italian context. And finally, just let me close with talking about some areas that I think are really interesting for future work. One is environmental policies. So pollution, for example, the air pollution problem in Torino the last week. Okay, that's going to affect the children born there for the rest of their lives. And there's pretty substantial research done in the 2000s by Ken Shea and Michael Greenstone that had used 100% birth records. So you can find people who were born in certain months of the year during the time that their mother was exposed to high levels of pollution. And they documented that those children have higher mortality rates. But if you can link the birth record forward to the earnings records, you can then say, do they also have lower earnings for the rest of their lives because of some, say, lung deficiency that emerged because in the third trimester their mother was under stress, respiratory stress. And we can also use the administrative records. There's an interesting paper by this guy who's looking at the effect of wildfire smoke. We had a lot of these problems actually have this problem in Italy too, but and that has an effect on earnings that he could literally evaluate and showed that effect is substantial in the United States. That essentially the earnings cost of wildfires is almost enough to cover the cost of fighting the fires in itself. Education policies, we've seen a little bit of this. What's probably needed here is extensive interagency cooperation. You need to get the education system to release its records to the Social Security system or the administrative data system, or you're going to have to hand do it like the guys were doing this morning with the data from Milan. But to do that on a larger scale, you're going to need to have more cooperation, and I think that's going to be something that we'll see going forward. There's already a few projects like this. This is possible to do in Texas and Florida already in the U.S. And finally, one last area that I don't have on the slide here is this intergenerational area. So everyone is now interested in intergenerational policy evaluation. And I think the reason is because we have, in many countries, extremely widening inequality, and we're essentially worried about, will the inequality we see today be magnified for the next generation or not? Is it possible to have policies that actually work against that, or policies that might multiply that, make it worse? And so the administrative databases potentially have the ability to help us answer that, and I think that's going to be a really important area going forward. So let me stop there.